Let us pray. Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I woke up this morning at 5:30 a.m. And I made my coffee, and I did what I do every morning, and I walked out on my back porch, and it was beautiful. Suzanne and I lament having moved to Ohio sometimes, usually about January or maybe in March when it still feels like January. But in the summertime, we do not lament having moved to Ohio because it's beautiful. Many of you guys have been to my house, and you know that there's a field behind my house which has, in the last 10 years, become something like a forest. And we always are able to look back in the morning into that field and see deer just waking up. And so that was my sight this morning. It was beautiful. And of course, I heard the morning dove cooing, which always reminds me of Texas, of home. And all seemed very well. But then I picked up my phone and I saw a notice that another young black man was shot in Atlanta last night. And once again, the city is in an uproar. So I was reminded of Psalm 46, which says the nations themselves are in an uproar. And of course, it's not just the nations around us. Our nation is raging, and our people are in an uproar. We have nearly 330 million Americans today. Our population is just under that. And if you are awake and if you're paying attention, if you watch the big news channels or surf the internet, then you may have noticed that around 228 million of these 300 million Americans are on social media yelling at each other about one thing or another just about every minute of every day. Does this cause anyone else any anxiety? I find it to be very anxiety-inducing. The way that it goes is people get on social media and they say, you must think like this. When you speak, you must use these words. You must not respond with the cliche thoughts and prayers. You must act now. Act now. Do what I say. So, have you guys heard this, by the way? This admonition against saying thoughts and prayers. Anybody? Yeah, it's kind of become common, If a Christian responds to some kind of a command or a demand or a crisis with the, I will pray about it, or you are in my thoughts, we are ridiculed. And I want to say, before I go on today, because I'm going to talk a little bit about prayer at the end of this sermon, that I can understand that sentiment a little bit. Very often this has become a cliche for Christians. It's just sort of a default. Without thinking too much about what prayer means, we just say thoughts and prayers, and that means that we're going to go on about our day, and we're not going to give it much thought, and we're probably not going to pray about it. And if we do pray about it, we may not put too much into what we are praying. And so people say, don't pray, don't think, just act. Recently, one of the worst examples of this tendency that I have seen came from a Southern Baptist pastor in Texas who was very, very famous. And I won't mention his name, although I don't mind mentioning his name, but I'm not going to mention his name. But the reason I don't mind mentioning his name is because I generally respect him. I think he is a person, he is a pastor, he's a leader with a tremendous amount of integrity, and because we all say stupid things sometimes, okay? This person said something kind of dumb just recently. He's a brother in Christ, and so we will forgive him, but this is what he said. He was preaching to his own congregation about some of the turmoil that we have been experiencing in this nation lately. And he was telling them what I am referencing right now. You must act. You must get up off your seats and do something. He said, this is not the time to critique the protest movements. Don't worry, he said, about the Marxist philosophy at the heart of Black Lives Matter, for instance. And then he said this, and I paraphrase, if Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, he would be a Marxist too, just like so many of these protesters. And then he said, don't worry about that. Just get behind this current movement for justice and act now. Now, at this point, I was watching the video, which is circulating around social media. I was pretty irritated, okay? Again, I like this pastor. I respect him. But every amateur student of history knows what happens when people fighting against real injustice embrace violence and anarchy and destruction. What happened in the 20th century, of course, when people, for instance, in Russia, were fighting against millions and millions of the most vulnerable people in Russia, in Southeast Asia, and in Latin America, were murdered by the very people who believed themselves to be fighting for justice. Marxism, in other words, is not a plaything. And acting in the wrong way can make an unjust situation much, much worse. And so when I hear people telling me, you must act now, and they themselves are acting in a way that is often violent, my reaction is to be critical, okay, to critique. I can't get on board. And so this morning, you're going to have to forgive me. And if you're with us for the very first time, please do forgive me. I'm going to go out on a limb just a little bit. You see, I do believe that in America, it's extremely clear that the church is in decline, is in rapid decline. I could give you all the statistics. I don't need to. We look at our culture and we can see that it's happening. Our church is in decline. The very shrill voices that we hear on social media are becoming louder. We are entering into a stage we are already partly into, a time in our society when we're going to go through a kind of crucible. We are entering into a crucible. And so we have to talk about these things. We have to know who we are. We have to seek the Lord, and that's what I want to talk about today, so that we might respond appropriately, because we don't want to blow it. We do want to be faithful. And so I'm going to go out on a limb just a little bit today. I want to be open, and I want to be transparent. Willingness to be corrected. I'm very willing to be corrected, but you can only be corrected if, in fact, you go out on a limb and say something. So I'm going to say a few things. The way I see it, when you pay attention to social media, and even to the big media outlets, we see really just two perspectives, what we might call the left and the right. On the left, we have much talk of systemic racism. We have a lot of talk about social, economic, and legal structures which are working against black communities. We hear the term white privilege, and we hear it very often. Our whole society, we are told, needs to take action in order to change these structures and to bring about racial equality. And so lists of demands and very specific proposals are being put forth. And of course, different proposals are being put forth by different groups, but often those who are screaming the most loudly offer the most radical proposals. And so we are hearing recently things like defund the police, disrupt the nuclear family, and much, much more. The policies that are being put forth are radical. They're radical. Now, on the right, we have people like Candace Owens. Has anybody seen the video of Candace Owens sort of denouncing Black Lives Matter? It's been making the rounds. I've seen it. Candace Owens argues that there really is not any longer something that we might call systemic racism. She says there's no such thing as white privilege, and she recounts her own life growing up in the South, where she claims that she really did not encounter racism, systemic racism. She believed that she herself was privileged. Candace Owens, as well as a handful of black scholars, often will sort of turn the conversation, and they will talk about statistics related to black-on-black crime. They will mention violent crime in general among the black community, and they will tell us things that are true. They'll list the data, and this is uncomfortable stuff, guys, but we have to talk about it, okay? The black population is only about 13% of the U.S. population, but commits 50% of the violent crime. We also know that the black family, since the 1960s, has been breaking down progressively. So much so that today, over 72% of all of the black babies born in the United States are born to single mothers. And what's really troubling about that is that we know that children born into single-parent households have a far greater statistical likelihood to be abused, perhaps by a stepfather or a man living in the home, or in the community with which they live. They're much more likely to suffer psychological trauma. They're more likely to commit crime, to be incarcerated, on and on and on and on. If you are a black child born to a single mother, then the cards are stacked against you, okay? The cards are stacked against you. And so instead of calling for structural changes in our society at large, people on the right, and it's not just Candace Owens, it's others, claim that what really needs to happen is that the black community needs to get its own house in order. I'm not an expert on these things, but I haven't heard a whole lot more than that. There's a strong pushback against the sort of social justice movement, and the claim always that the black community needs to get its own house in order. Now, Candace Owens, of course, is called an Uncle Tom, and we are told not to listen to these outlying voices. So what are we to think, What are we to think? I mean, some of us might have our minds made up, and we might be very comfortably on one side or the other, but if we're not, then what exactly are we to think? I'm just going to tell you what I believe, okay? And I am genuinely open to correction. I believe the statistics that are cited by people like Candace Owens are true, and they're very troubling. I don't think we can ignore those statistics. They have to be affirmed. They have to be considered in order to address the problems at hand, okay? However, these statistics are, in my mind, the clearest evidence that serious structural injustice, systemic racism, you might say, really does exist. Black people in this country have it really bad, okay? They do. And how can we not expect them to be crying out for justice, when so many of them live in communities with no fathers at all, and when they know that the young men are going to reach a certain age and that the likelihood that they're going to be incarcerated is very, very high, I also believe that the statistics offer one of the greatest explanations for white privilege, which is a term I think we should not discount. Okay, you guys with me here, okay? The idea of white privilege is that a white person nearly as likely to be under suspicion by a police officer, driving, and especially, and you're driving through a white neighborhood, you are under suspicion. And I have close friends, and I have close former students who testify, who say, you must believe us. As a young black man, I have experienced this my whole life, okay? You don't experience the world the way that I experience the world. You have white privilege. I don't. You guys with me here? Okay? I believe we have to affirm that. It's true, and it's the place we have to start. Now, the statistics, however, explain that privilege because the fact that 13% of the population commits about 50% of the violent crimes in this country means that police officers can't be expected not to be more fearful when they encounter young black men than when they encounter young white men. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay? And so, of course, these young black men experienced the world differently. But also, of course, the police officers interact with that community in a very different way than they interact with our community. Okay? So let's lay all this out on the table, is my perspective. Let's lay it out on the table. We have to be able to talk about these things. But the question still is, how should we respond? What are we to do? If we're trying to sort of find our footing in a world where everybody is screaming, act, 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 what are we to do? How are we to act? Should we join the crowds and demand that the police be defunded? I know a lot of people who are doing that right now. I really do. Former students, friends, on social media. Yes, defund the police, tear down the systems, throw the world as we know it out the window. Or should we say to the black community, you get your own houses in order? I don't think so, okay? What an unloving kind of a thing to say to black brothers and sisters in Christ. How can we possibly say that? My hope is that the people of St. John's will not do either of these things. I hope we'll look for a third option. And so I believe that the state of the black community, including things like black-on-black crime, high rates of incarceration, massive family breakdown, is the result of a long and complex history. And at some point, we have to be able to talk about that long and complex history, and it's hard to do that amidst all the shrill voices. 250 years of slavery. A black community coming out of slavery, which just decimated a people. Enter then into 100 years of Jim Crow laws. Coming out of those Jim Crow laws only in the 1960s, in order to enter into a world where policies have been put forward, some of which helped a little bit, and many of which were extremely harmful. Okay? Am I losing any of you guys here? And what I'm talking about right now are especially policies which have led to the breakdown of the black family. LBJ and the Great Society, which began to reward welfare mothers for having children out of wedlock, led to a situation where there has been tremendous financial incentive to tear apart the families of those who are poorest. And because the black family, coming out of 250 years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow laws, was overwhelmingly poor, they suffered the consequence of terrible national policies more than any other community. Okay? So, if we're going to do anything at all, if we're going to act in any way, we have to act based upon the truth, and the truths are complicated. And so we have to know those truths. We have to be confident, okay, at least in our ability to communicate those truths, and we have to act in love, because that is what, as Christians, we are called to do. So, what do we do if we've lost confidence in our politicians to even diagnose the problems rightly? And I've lost confidence in our politicians to diagnose these problems rightly. The conversation that we're having right here, right now, I wish it was more of a conversation, but it's mainly just me talking. It's not one you hear very often. It's really not. Why don't we hear this more often? So here's my advice. My advice is that when people all around, even in the face of real injustice, are carrying torches and are screaming at us to act now, we absolutely should not and cannot ignore the cries of injustice, because there is real injustice. We should definitely get to know our black brothers and sisters better, and we should listen to them. That's one of the main things that the black community is asking for right now, is just please listen to us. Sit down and listen to us. I am going to do that more and more. I hope I won't be the only person in our community doing that more and more. But in a cultural moment like this, our first instinct has to be, and should always be, to step back and to take a deep breath and to seek the Lord. In other words, we cannot listen to those people who tell us thoughts and prayers don't cut it, okay? Thoughts and prayers from a faithful people absolutely cut it and must be our first response. And so in a sea of shrill and angry voices, we should search for the voice of God as we are listening to many other voices. Remember the words of Habakkuk, often spoken at the start of morning prayer. You guys all familiar with this sentence that Dale finished with as he was reading Habakkuk? The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. Remember these words. God is in his holy temple. He is exercising his sovereign providence over this world, even as the nations are raging. So let's keep silence and let's remember him. Or consider the words of Psalm 46. These are good words, and they're true words for us, and these are good and they are true words for people everywhere who face injustice in ways that most of us certainly do not face injustice. Here's what we read in Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be moved, and though the hills be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters rage and swell, and though the mountains shake at its tempest. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling place of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, therefore she shall not be moved. God shall help her at the break of day. The nations are in an uproar, and the kingdoms are moved. But God has lifted his voice, and the earth shall melt away. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. O come and behold the works of the Lord. What devastations he has brought upon the earth. He makes wars to cease in all the world. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear and burns the chariots in the fire. Be still, he says to all his people, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Now, if you read the Weekly Dispatch, my Wednesday newsletter, you know that I claimed I was going to begin a series on the book of Romans today. Anybody pay attention to this? Okay. Anybody notice that we did not read from Romans this morning? Well, Friday morning, I was thinking, and I was especially thinking about the way that everyone says these days, don't go to thoughts and prayers. I was bothered by that, and I am bothered by that. And so my instinct was to say, no, I would like to go to thoughts and prayers. If in fact the world is saying no thoughts and prayers, then it may in fact be the case that prayer has become something of a cliche for us, and certainly for the people to whom we are witnessing. And so what I'm going to do, instead of a series on Romans, is begin a series on prayer. And in the midst of the world of shrill voices, we're going to spend the whole summer talking about prayer. We'll start next week, and I have no idea how long we're going to go. We're just going to kind of go week by week, and we'll talk about the theology of prayer. We'll talk about the practice of prayer. We'll talk about prayer in Scripture. We will eventually get to prayer in the Anglican tradition because we are a prayer book people. And prayer is what we do. It's what we actually should do best. And so let's understand it, and let's affirm it, and let's practice it in such a way that nobody would ever dare to say, don't respond with thoughts and prayers, because they know that when we say that, we mean something by it. And what we mean by it is meaningful. Okay? So, as I close today, let me make 3 quick points. And these are going to be very quick, which I hope will guide this upcoming series on prayer. First of all, as I've already mentioned, prayer really can be cliche. It should horrify us that thoughts and prayers has become a joke. That should horrify us. It means maybe that people aren't listening, but it might also mean that we have not taken prayer seriously enough ourselves. However, misuse should not lead to the abandonment of prayer. It should be leading us to a reconsideration of prayer, to a more serious approach to prayer. So we don't want prayer to be cliche among us. Second point, prayer is not separate from action. And so a response of thoughts and prayers is never the opposite of saying, I will do something. Rather, to say, I will pray about that means that I will work to discern the right action as I listen to the voice of God and interact in dialogue with the voice of God, primarily through the Word of God. So prayer is not separate from action, and it cannot be separate from action. And then third, prayer really is powerful. It is serious business, and it's an unfortunate thing that in our world we don't believe that prayer is something that has to be learned, but prayer is something that has to be learned. In fact, it's one of the only things that the disciples actually asked Jesus to teach them. In Matthew 6, they said, teach us how to pray. Well, of course we should be taught how to pray, just like we need to be taught how to worship. If you think about what prayer is actually communicating with God. And so our whole problem as human beings is that our relationship to God has been disrupted. And so we have to reestablish the lines of communication. That's precisely what prayer is. Growth in prayer is actually synonymous with growth in sanctification and holiness. And so we want to learn how to pray. And all of us have to learn that throughout our lives. So those are my 3 points. Let's learn to pray so that we might be the kind of people in whom and through whom God's kingdom comes and God's peace reigns on earth. And we offer all of this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.